December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns. Within hours, America declares war. Within weeks, military planners face a crisis that threatens to cripple the war effort before it begins. Japan controls 90% of the world's natural rubber supply, and America's war machine runs on rubber. Tank treads, aircraft tires, gas masks, boots, electrical insulation, submarine seals, every piece of modern warfare demands rubber. The British had stockpiled. The Germans had synthesized alternatives before the war. America had nothing. A single B-17 bomber required half a ton of rubber. A battleship needed 20,000 rubber components. The Pentagon calculated they needed 800,000 tons of rubber annually to sustain combat operations. Existing stockpiles would run out in 18 months. Military strategists stared at projections showing American tanks immobilized, aircraft grounded, and infantry unequipped, not from enemy action, but from a missing agricultural product grown 8,000 miles away. The solution they found didn't come from mines or oil fields. It came from cornfields in Iowa, and the substance they created would change the course of industrial history. The rubber crisis of 1942 represented an existential threat to American military ambitions. Natural rubber comes from the Hevea brasiliensis tree, which grows almost exclusively in Southeast Asia. When Japan swept through Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and French Indochina in early 1942, they seized control of 97% of America's rubber imports. President Roosevelt declared rubber the most critical material shortage facing the nation, more critical than steel, more critical than oil, because without rubber you couldn't move the steel or transport the oil. The British had prepared for this scenario, building stockpiles throughout the 1930s. Germany had invested heavily in Bunares synthetic rubber production since 1935. America had ignored the warnings, assuming the Pacific would remain secure. Now the bill came due. Washington faced two options: surrender the Pacific and negotiate rubber access with Japan, or invent an entirely new material science in record time. They chose option 3, turn American agriculture into a chemical weapons factory. The answer already existed, buried in research that military planners had dismissed as theoretical. In 1940, chemists at Northern Regional Research Laboratory in Peoria, Illinois, had been experimenting with agricultural waste products, searching for industrial applications for surplus corn. One experiment involved fermenting corn sugar with specific bacteria strains to produce a polymer called dextran. Nobody cared. Corn was cheap, rubber was cheaper. Why synthesize what nature provided abundantly? Then Pearl Harbor changed everything. On January 15, 1942, the War Production Board issued an urgent mandate: find a rubber substitute from domestic materials within 6 months. Petroleum-based synthetic rubber programs ramped up immediately, but they required years to reach meaningful production scale. Something faster was needed, something that could be deployed using existing agricultural infrastructure. Dr. Robert M. Hickson, head of chemistry at Iowa State College, had spent the 1930s researching cornstarch polymers. His work had been considered academic curiosity until December 1941, when it became a matter of national survival. Hickson's team discovered that chemically treating cornstarch with specific acids and heat could produce a substance with rubber-like elasticity. It wasn't natural rubber. It wasn't synthetic rubber derived from petroleum. It was something entirely different, a bio-based polymer created from corn glucose. The military codenamed the project Cornstarch Conversion Protocol. The chemical process they developed transformed ordinary corn into a material that could withstand battlefield stress, temperature extremes, and chemical exposure. Initial tests showed the corn-based polymer possessed 60% of natural rubber's tensile strength, not perfect, but functional. And most importantly, it could be mass-produced using the vast American corn surplus. Creating a rubber substitute from corn required solving problems that no chemist had confronted before. Natural rubber possesses a unique molecular structure, long chains of isoprene units that give it elasticity, durability, and resilience. Cornstarch consists of glucose molecules, completely different chemistry, completely different properties. The breakthrough came from understanding that rubber's value lay not in its chemical composition, but in its physical properties. If you could create long polymer chains with similar flexibility and strength, the source material didn't matter. Dr. Hickson's team developed a multi-stage process. First, extract cornstarch and break it down into glucose through acid hydrolysis. Second, ferment glucose using specific bacterial cultures to produce intermediate polymers. Third, chemically cross-link these polymers using sulfur compounds, vulcanization, the same process used for natural rubber. Fourth, add carbon black and other fillers to improve strength and durability. The result was a material that looked like rubber, flexed like rubber, and under laboratory conditions, performed like rubber. But laboratories aren't battlefields. The real test came when the military demanded samples for field trials. In June 1942, experimental corn-based rubber compounds were shipped to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Engineers molded them into tank treads, truck tires, and artillery components. Then they subjected them to hell: extreme heat, freezing cold, continuous flexing, chemical exposure, and sustained battlefield simulation. The corn rubber passed. Not perfectly. It degraded faster than natural rubber under extreme heat and lacked some resilience under continuous stress. But it worked well enough for non-critical applications: boots, gaskets, electrical insulation, conveyor belts, and yes, certain types of vehicle tires for rear echelon transport. By autumn 1942, the War Production Board authorized full-scale production. Corn processing facilities across the Midwest were retrofitted with chemical reactors. Farmers who had been paid to limit corn production under New Deal agricultural policies suddenly found themselves on the front lines of materials science. Iowa, Illinois, and Nebraska became rubber factories. The first combat deployment came in North Africa. General Patton's supply trucks rolled into Tunisia on tires partially composed of corn-derived polymers. Drivers reported the tires wore faster than standard rubber, but performed adequately under operational conditions. More importantly, they existed, which was more than could be said for natural rubber alternatives. The Pacific Theater presented the ultimate test. In the sweltering jungles of Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Philippines, American forces used boots with corn rubber soles. Marines initially complained about durability issues, but combat reports noted that men equipped with corn rubber boots fought just as effectively as those with dwindling supplies of natural rubber footwear. When the alternative was going barefoot, corn suddenly seemed miraculous. The material found unexpected applications: electrical insulation for field communication equipment, seals for portable water purification systems, gaskets for medical equipment, anywhere that demanded flexible, waterproof, chemically resistant material. Corn rubber filled the gap. Aircraft production provided the most dramatic validation. While critical components like landing gear tires still required natural or petroleum-based synthetic rubber, dozens of secondary systems used corn-derived materials: fuel line seals, electrical insulation, cockpit weather stripping. A single B-17 bomber contained approximately 150 pounds of non-critical rubber components. Substituting corn-based materials for even half of those freed up natural rubber for essential systems. By 1943, American factories produced approximately 40,000 tons of corn-based rubber annually. It never replaced natural or petroleum-based synthetic rubber, both of which achieved massive production scale by late 1943, but it filled a critical gap during the darkest period of the rubber crisis. And more importantly, it proved that agricultural waste could become strategic war material. Not everyone celebrated corn rubber. Traditionalists in the chemical industry dismissed it as inferior. Oil companies lobbied aggressively for petroleum-based synthetics, which offered better performance. Farmers worried that wartime chemical production would poison their fields. It didn't, but the fear persisted. Military engineers complained about inconsistent quality. Early batches varied wildly in performance depending on corn variety, processing conditions, and manufacturing quality control. One shipment of corn rubber truck tires failed catastrophically during testing in Arizona heat. Another batch performed flawlessly in Alaskan cold. The inconsistency frustrated logistics officers who wanted standardized, predictable materials. But here's what the critics missed: wars aren't won by perfect solutions. They're won by functional solutions deployed fast enough to matter. Corn rubber wasn't perfect. It was available. And in 1942, availability mattered more than perfection. The soldiers who used corn rubber boots didn't care about polymer chemistry. They cared that their feet stayed dry. The engineers who installed corn rubber gaskets didn't debate molecular structure. They cared that the equipment worked. The truck drivers who rolled on corn-derived tires didn't analyze tensile strength. They cared that supplies reached the front. Corn rubber worked, Not always as well as alternatives, not in every application, but it worked when nothing else was available, and that's what battlefield pragmatism looks like. By 1944, petroleum-based synthetic rubber production had ramped up to over 800,000 tons annually. Natural rubber supplies resumed as Allied forces retook Southeast Asia. Corn-based rubber production quietly wound down. The crisis had passed. But the legacy remained. The corn rubber program proved that agricultural materials could substitute for geological resources in industrial applications. Post-war chemists applied lessons learned during the crisis to develop plastics, adhesives, and polymers from biological feedstocks. The field of industrial biotechnology traces its roots directly to laboratories in Iowa that turned corn into war material under impossible deadlines. Today, bio-based polymers represent a multi-billion-dollar industry. Corn-derived plastics, adhesives, and materials appear in everything from packaging to medical devices. The technology dismissed as wartime desperation became the foundation for sustainable materials science. The corn rubber program never won any battles. No general credited it with victory. No medal recognized its contribution, but it kept American forces mobile during the most critical period of the war. It proved that innovation under pressure doesn't require perfection, it requires pragmatism. In 1942, America faced a choice between impossible and unthinkable. They couldn't access rubber, they couldn't fight without it, so they turned cornfields into factories, chemistry into strategy, and agricultural surplus into military necessity. The weapon that saved American logistics wasn't a bomb or a tank. It was a kernel of corn transformed by chemistry, desperation, and American agricultural ingenuity. Critics called it inferior, engineers called it inconsistent, soldiers called it available, and in war available beats perfect every single time. 60,000 tons of corn-based rubber, millions of boots, thousands of gaskets, hundreds of thousands of components that kept the war machine running when conventional wisdom said it should have stopped. Not because it was the best solution, but because it was the solution that existed when nothing else did. That's not just the story of corn rubber. That's the story of how wars are actually won, not with miracle weapons, but with practical solutions deployed by people who refused to accept that impossible meant unachievable. The fields of Iowa didn't just feed America during World War II, they equipped it. And the substance they created now sits in museums and history books, a reminder that the most critical innovations often come not from laboratories seeking perfection, but from desperate people solving unsolvable problems with whatever materials they have available. Corn into rubber, agriculture into industry, desperation into victory, that's not just materials science, that's war.